Well, for some time now, for the last 10 or 15 years, I've been trying to understand all the situations in nature in which the genes within a single individual are in disagreement, or put differently, in which genes within an individual are being selected in conflicting directions. It's an enormous topic which 20 years ago looked like just a little shadow on the horizon, as they once said in physics about 100 years ago about what later became relativity theory. There were just two little shadows on the horizon of physics at the beginning of the 20th century that blew up and became major developments. Well, within genetics, I think it's fair to say that about 20 years ago, a little cloud on the horizon was our knowledge that there were so-called selfish genetic elements in various species which propagated themselves at the expense of the larger organism. And what has happened in the meantime is that what was then just a cloud on the horizon is now a full force storm, gale winds blowing, an enormous amount of work pouring out on it, and an appreciation that far from an unusual kind of rare exception, this phenomenon is a minority phenomenon in all organisms, including ourselves, and must by logic and by evidence have been an important problem throughout the evolution of the genomic system, the genetic system, how to try to control and prevent the further spread of such selfish elements. So there's a kind of dynamical relationship between these elements on the one hand and the rest of the organism, or put in genetic terms, all the non-linked genes, all the other non-linked genes in the organism, which will tend to be selected to suppress these elements, which will then select on the part of the elements for further tricks in a coevolutionary struggle. The more I've worked on it, the more it has seemed analogous in various ways to social interactions at the level of individuals within groups. Some of the same terms we find useful in the latter context, like cooperative behavior or selfish or spiteful or altruistic, can all also be applied to genetic interactions within the individual that run into conflict with each other. There can be spiteful genes, there can be merely selfish genes, there's a whole bunch of cooperative ones. There are narrowly altruistic ones, only help copies of themselves, don't help other non-linked genes in both directions away from it. So this is a deep and important subject, and we are now at last being able to see the thing as a unified whole and relate the different parts to each other. So that's one major area that has been important enough to have sucked me into it for 15 years. Genetics is extremely, it's extremely difficult, I think it's fair to say. It's certainly very difficult. However, it's also very rewarding. You get an exactness out of genetics, beginning with Mendel's famous quantitative P ratios. It's a quantitative, exact science. It's very beautiful, but it's also difficult to master. Now that's one whole area of evolutionary biology that I'm very enthusiastic about, and also it's been a time in coming. We've had a long, wonderful tradition of learning an endless series of interesting and sometimes incredible facts about the genetic systems of different organisms without having much of a clear evolutionary logic for how natural selection works on the genetic system itself, separate from the phenotypic effects of genes, which are then selected for upwards or downwards. So this is a major avenue into that. Has a personal irony for me also, in that some of those who were most vitriolic against the kind of social theory that I worked on in the 70s were geneticists, evolutionary geneticists. I expect them to be equally or perhaps even more displeased with this development. I think it is true that the zeitgeist is such that we are in the process of putting together an evolutionary psychology now. As so often, the first hints of it are people running around saying evolutionary psychology is coming, evolutionary psychology is coming, but they haven't actually done much work to bring it on. Now we're actually getting empirical work of increasingly high quality on aspects of human psychology interpreted in an evolutionary way. The particular sub-area that I'm interested in developing myself has to do with the structure of the mind in terms of conscious, unconscious, in terms of biased information flow between the conscious and the unconscious, within the unconscious, and the very peculiar and counterintuitive fact that humans in a variety of situations misrepresent reality to the conscious mind while keeping in the unconscious either a fully accurate or in any case a more accurate view of that which they misrepresent to the conscious mind. And that seems so counterintuitive that it begs explanation. Counterintuitive because you would have thought after natural selection ground away for 4 billion years and produced these eyeballs capable of all the subtlety that's in front of our eyes, and color, motion detection, the detailed granularity that we see and so on, our hearing, that you would have perfected these organs for the apprehension of reality and then would have gone around and systematically distorted the information once it reached you. That seems like a strange way to design a railroad, so to speak. Well, it's a truism in science that those problems that most directly contradict current thinking or most directly challenge the system of logic you're committed to are apt to be the most fruitful in revealing deeper aspects of reality. An example would be the mystery of why sexual reproduction is so overwhelmingly common in larger organisms, even though there's a simple argument for why asexual reproduction should trounce it. So anyway, I'm very interested in throwing myself into evolutionary psychology, and in particular this area of self-deception, which I believe whose function I believe is intimately connected to deception of others. So I think if you guys are trying to see through me right now, and if I'm lying about something you actually care about, that what you see first, to speak loosely, is my conscious mind and its behavioral effects. You know, you can get some sense of my mood, of my affect, quality of voice might give you stress while trying to deceive you, etc. The unconscious, much harder for you to figure out what my unconscious is up to. You have to make a study of my behavior, such as a spouse will do, to your dismay at times. So one simple logic is that we hide things in our unconscious precisely to hide them from other people, or precisely the better to hide them from other people, so that the key interaction driving this is deception. So I often talk about deceit and self-deception in the same voice, because I don't think you see self-deception properly if you don't appreciate its deceptive possibilities. And likewise, if you talk about deception without any reference to self-deception, then you tend unconsciously to limit yourself to consciously promoted deception, and you tend to overlook unconsciously promulgated deception. So each failure to link the two topics limits one's understanding of the topic under consideration, so I imagine. And one last little thought here which connects the two areas I've been talking about. There is finally a new area of within individual deception that is related to self-deception directed towards others, but in a complex way that has not been worked out. And that's the extraordinary finding that our maternal genes and our paternal genes, that is, those we inherited from our mother and those we inherited from our father, are capable of being in conflict with each other, each acting to advance the interests of the relevant parent and his or her relatives. And you can have a form of internal deception where the maternal side is overrepresenting maternal interests, which the paternal side is discounting, and vice versa.